all, I would like to highlight that, this is one of the very few programs, not just in India. I think when we were offering this program for the first time in 2021, it was the only such course in India where a university was offering an LLM in regulation and governance, especially in a law school. And even if you look worldwide, very few universities provide this degree. And however, on the other hand, if you look at practice side, regulatory practice, you see that there's a huge rise in the number of regulatory institutions and independent regulators across the country. Regulatory practice is rising. The law firms put a lot of emphasis on regulatory practice, be it financial sector, infrastructure, environmental regulations. And so, therefore, a program like this has become very important. Now, me in the audience might have this question: How will an LLM in regulation and governance help you in your career progression, or what is the importance of such a program altogether? So, if you have such a question, to answer this, let me just give you a brief about the rise of the regulatory state, and how with the rise of the regulatory state, there was establishment of independent regulatory bodies and institutions across the global south, including countries like India. I'm sure all of you would have heard of the economic liberalization which happened in India in the 90s. And it was a watershed moment in the country. Our economy liberalized. And with that, there were several changes in different economic sectors. And one such was the establishment of independent regulatory institutions in the country. And this phenomena of the rise of independent regulatory institutions was seen across the globe, especially in the global south, where, one key reason was to politically insulate certain decision-making, administrative, executive actions in certain economic sectors from political decision-making, so that independent regulators decide on certain issues in certain sectors, and which would lead to efficient functioning. For example, if I can give you an example, it would be the electricity sector, one such sector where first independent regulators came into being. In Orissa, we had the first electricity regulator in the country, which was an independent regulator. And this was suggested by consultants, especially from the World Bank, which promoted certain kind of, because independent regulators are quite common in the US. And so, as you know, World Bank was quite backed by the American economy and the Americans. So they also promoted such regulatory institutions in the global south. And one such example was in Orissa in the 90s, where you had independent regulators in the electricity sector, because before elections, the politicians would make huge promises that we will give subsidies in the electricity sector, will give free electricity. As a result, there was a lot of loss making in the electricity sector, and therefore many felt that there was a need to insulate these sectors of the economy from the politics altogether and establish independent regulators. And therefore, World Bank suggested this, and in states like Orissa and many other places, you had independent regulatory bodies coming up. However, it did not yield the results which it was to yield. It could not insulate itself from the politics of the country. But nevertheless, this was the beginning of the rise of regulatory state. In 1996, we had the Telecom Regulatory Authority in India. Similarly, Competition Commission and other several regulatory bodies came into being. Oil and gas sector is well regulated. There are regulatory bodies in many sectors of the economy. So as you see, as we have so many regulatory institutions, which are quasi-judicial bodies who have their administrative power, as well as certain judicial functions which they execute. And but there is an in-depth knowledge which is required if one is to practice in these sectors. Suppose tomorrow, if you have a matter on electricity, or for example, if you have, nowadays drones have become quite popular. Anyone who vlogs or records videos use drones. So drones are regulated by the DGCA, Director General of Civil Aviation. So there are drone regulations in the country. And tomorrow, as a young lawyer or as someone working in a firm, if you want to understand drone regulations, an in-depth knowledge of not just these regulations, but how did this concept of regulatory state come into being? How did these regulatory institutions overall evolve becomes quite important. And as such, through this program, we provide a year-long program which not only helps you understand the functions of these bodies, but also the entire history, how these regulations come into being, the economics of regulations, how politics and policies influence regulation, and so on. So we came up with this unique program to help young lawyers get into regulatory practice and also understand the rise of the modern regulatory state in the country. And as Professor Shiju asked, the program structure is quite unique. So we fully adhere to UGC regulations and guidelines. As such, we have certain compulsory foundational courses, which are research methods and legal writing, where you learn about the basics of legal research. How do you do citation? How do you write research papers? How do you publish papers, develop a research project, work on it, execute it, and so on. Thereafter, we also have two courses on law and justice in a globalizing world and comparative public law. Apart from these foundational courses, which are required due to UGC regulations and guidelines, we also have required courses. So these are specific courses where you understand economics of regulation, regulatory state, and then environmental regulation. There's also a course on public policy. So this would provide this second cluster of required courses would provide you the base for understanding regulations in the country, the overall theoretical understanding. And thereafter, in the final part, you have your specialization courses where you develop in-depth knowledge in particular sectors of regulation. So we currently offer three clusters. First is infrastructure and sustainability cluster, where you'll focus on energy and infrastructure laws. And thereafter, we have a corporate and financial regulations cluster, where the focus is on banking, insolvency, securities, and insurance related regulations. And finally, technology, law, and policy cluster, which is where we look at regulations in the new frontiers of technology law, especially things like AI, cryptocurrency, data protection, drone regulation, and so on. So, and this is followed by a dissertation where you need to write a thesis. And, overall, what this course provides is a very comprehensive course, which would actually equip any young lawyer who goes through it for regulatory practice. Today, many of the firms specialize in regulatory practice. And apart from firms, many people also want to pursue academia and get into, teaching regulations, regulatory laws. Like I myself, I teach a course on regulatory state. So therefore, I think it's quite a comprehensive course, and young lawyers who are interested in regulations are very much welcome to be a part of it.